Everyone, happy Wednesday. I hope you are doing well, and we are going to finish up chapter 18 today, which is An Unsettled World, 1890 to 1914. And our discussion today looks specifically at the idea of race and nationalism. So, rethinking race. Many people began to embrace the idea that their identity, their race, and even their ethnicity, their national heritage, it was deeply rooted and it was unchangeable. And their race in particular was based on a certain set of biological, physical characteristics. And this was encouraged even further through the Linnaean classification system, which you've probably talked about in biology, something about King Philip, kingdom, phylum, species, genus. I'll say genus or genus? Genus. Family, order, I don't know them all. But this led to the idea that not only could species be classified according to from like smallest to greatest, but people could as well. And so this became like a new way of classifying races, and they would base it on skin color and hair texture and bone structure and things like that. And so over time, especially in the West, science became something that was used to sanction racial inequalities. And so scientists talked about different separate races, white and black and yellow and red. And doctors warned against racial mixing. They believed that if people mixed races, then they would have weak offspring who would likely become prostitutes or criminals or homosexuals. And so people really got carried away with this at the turn of the century, this idea that race was biological. All right, so looking at race and nation in North America. So one of the most obvious examples of restricting races in U.S. history is the Jim Crow laws in the South. Jim Crow laws in southern states enshrined segregation in the law. And so it was legal in the South to discriminate on the basis of race and to allow certain races in your business or to forbid certain races from coming into your business. And so segregation was very much enforced through the law on this basis of these biological differences. So in the West, the Chinese were especially discriminated against. If you're in APUSH, we talked about how in California, the state began to write laws that would eliminate and certainly discriminate against the Chinese. And so this kind of culminated in 1892 in the Chinese Exclusion Act, where they just forbid all Chinese people from coming into the country. It was renewed several times after that. And then there was also, so this is another thing we talked about in APUSH, but in the second wave of immigration to the United States, rather than having like Germans and Irish people who were going to assimilate to American culture, they would learn English. Many of them practiced Protestantism. Unlike them, in the second wave of people from Southern and Eastern Europe, many of these people came with radical ideas, Marxism, socialism, all sorts of ideas that people in the United States did not feel comfortable with. And so white Americans worried about immigrants that were coming from these Eastern and Southern European countries. And so they began to discriminate against them, and the United States even began to enforce immigration limitations. Okay, so this idea of mixing races was also a problem for people in Latin America. The Mexican government in particular viewed natives as an obstacle to change in Mexico. And they felt like if Europeans in Mexico mixed with natives in Mexico, that it would hurt this nationalist movement. And a similar thing happened in Brazil and Cuba with African Americans. They felt like these minority groups would present an obstacle to their nationalist movements and to progress in those countries. And so, interestingly, in order to promote unity, in order to promote nationalism, not only did they discourage the mixing of races, but they also promoted unity by coming up with this like mythic past. I know we're not talking about Germany, but in Germany they had like the Grimm's folk tales, like Hansel and Gretel. But many countries did this. Mexico did this. Mexican General Porfirio Diaz wrote these stories or had these stories about Father Hidalgo, who was a leader in the Mexican Revolution, and he pushed this guy as like, the face of Mexico. Like we should celebrate him. That he is a symbol of our unified Mexican past. And they even looked back to like ancient Aztec cities and how beautiful they were and how magnificent they were, and pointed to Aztec grandeur as a symbol of their unified Mexican past. Oh, that's weird with the shadow thing. Okay, so nationalism, these types of ideas and nationalism didn't just happen in Latin America or North America, but they also took place in Asia. So in China, there was a guy named Dr. Sun Yat-sen who wanted to stir up this nationalist movement in China. And so he looked back to the Han Chinese past for inspiration. The ruling dynasty at the time were not Han Chinese people, they were Manchu, and this was the Qing dynasty. And so Sun Yat-sen blasted them, saying that they weren't truly Chinese, they were more like dictators. And he was pushing for a unified, nationalistic, democratic China that would be free of Manchu rule, with an economic system that was based on equal land rights. So looking at India specifically, so one of the things that had brought unity to India was British colonialism. India had a very decentralized past in that they really didn't have very many periods of Indian history where there was like a strong centralized government. There was the Mughal dynasty. We talked about like the Gupta and the Maurya, but for the most part, India was very decentralized. The British actually brought about a sense of unity and nationhood to India. But there was a resistance movement where Indians began to kind of throw off this British colonialism and identify more with their Indian past. And one of the ways that this was done was through the Indian National Congress. And the Indian National Congress would actually lead the movement to gain independence from the British Empire. They began to demand greater Indian representation in government and administrative and legislative bodies. They also began to, in an outspoken way, begin to criticize government policies. Another conduit of Indian nationalism and Indian unity was the revival of Hinduism. People began to identify more with their Hindu past, and they also began to form, or activists began to form, voluntary organizations that operated for the sole purpose of pushing indigenous manufacturing. So rather than buying like finished products from Great Britain like soap or textiles or iron or whatever, these voluntary organizations would encourage people to buy locally made Indian soap and Indian cloth and medicine or iron or paper. Although most of these voluntary organizations failed, this symbolized a desire for unity and autonomy and stronger Indian nationalism. So the Pan movements. The Pan movements began to gain traction in the early 1900s. And this simply means that people were linking together across state borders. So they were identifying with people in other countries who either shared a religion or an ethnic heritage with them. This was problematic for multi-ethnic or multi-religious empires, like the Ottoman Empire and the Habsburg Empire. These were very diverse empires, and so these governments were threatened by the fact that their own constituents were identifying with people of other empires. So one of these movements was Pan-Islamism, and this was founded by Jamal al-Din Afghani, probably butchered that, but he urged Muslims to overcome their differences and to unite against the West. And this was problematic for governments who saw that some of their people were identifying with Muslims in other places. They felt like that was a threat to their nation's government. Another movement, not based on religion, but based on ethnic heritage, was Pan-Germanism. And there were German speakers all over Central Europe. And so these German-speaking elites kind of scattered throughout Central Europe and living in Slavic lands and everywhere else began to unite together. And there was a guy named George von Schroner who founded the League of German Nationalists. He wound up being elected to the Austrian Congress, and ultimately his goal was to bring all Austrian Germans into the German Empire. He actually was an anti-Semite as well. I'm not sure if that's what you call them, anti-Semitist? Semite? I'm not sure. I'll look it up as soon as I'm done with this. But he pushed for several measures against Jews as well, lots of anti-Jewish legislation. And then Pan-Slavism was a movement as well. There were Slavic peoples who were scattered throughout many different nations, and Pan-Slavism in Eastern and Central Europe, that for the most part they were demanding greater autonomy within their own countries. All right, so that is it for today. I hope you guys have an awesome day and a wonderful spring break. And don't forget to send me a picture of your notes.